Psalm 84 is what most Bible commentators call a pilgrim psalm. You may want to write just right above Psalm 84 and put that down. Put a pilgrim psalm. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, every Jewish male was required to worship at the temple at least 3 times a year, if at all possible. I want to show you where God commands that. Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 16. 3 times in a year shall all the males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of the unleavened bread, and in the feast of the weeks, and in the feast of tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty. So, they were required to make this pilgrimage to Jerusalem. For many, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem was the highlight of their year. It was like a homecoming where they would see family that they had not seen for quite some time. They would also get to see all the sights and all the sounds of the big city of Jerusalem. They would also get to enter into the temple and to see the splendor of that incredible structure. Many of them would be traveling from great distances, and they would endure all kinds of hardships along the way. And so when they would get weary, and when they would get really discouraged on their pilgrimage, they would sing what we call the Pilgrim Psalms. And that's what we have here in Psalm 84. Most Bible commentators will tell you that it is believed that Psalm 84 was one of those psalms that they would sing along the way when they got discouraged and whenever they got weary in the journey. If you take the time to read all 12 verses, and we're not going to take the time this morning, but if you look at all 12 verses, you will find expressions like, and glance down if you will, notice the expression, thy tabernacles in verse 1. Notice the courts of the Lord in verse 2. Notice thine altars in verse 3. Notice the house of my God in verse 10. And notice the word Zion in verse 7. All these statements express their deep longing, their intense desire to be in Jerusalem, in God's house, the temple, and in the presence of God, worshiping Him. Now you need to know that as those who were traveling from northern Palestine approached their last leg of the journey, they would go through the valley of Baca as they ascended up to the temple in Jerusalem. Don't forget that they didn't have cars, they didn't have buses, they didn't have trains, and they didn't have airplanes to make their journey to Jerusalem. They were either traveling by foot, they were riding on an animal, or maybe they hitched a ride in a cart that was being pulled by an animal. But by the time they got to the valley of Baca, they were not only physically tired and physically exhausted from the long journey, but they were also out of water for themselves, and they were out of water for their animals. That's why in verse 6, look at it again, Psalm 84 verse 6, we read those words, make it a well. The pilgrims who first arrived in the valley of Baca would have to dig wells in order to find water. Now, how many of you have ever dug a well? All right. Most of you have not. If you go overseas into third world countries, many times you will find that they will dig for wells out in a very barren or deserted area, and they will dig and try to dig deep to have just a little bit of water that would come up for them to quench their thirst and also provide water for their flock. Well, this was what was taking place here in the valley of Baca. The pilgrims who would arrive there first would begin to dig those wells in order to find some water. And then those who would come after those first pilgrims would benefit from those wells that had already been dug by those who had passed before them. And so the water from the wells, and then notice also in verse 6 that God sent from heaven the rain that enabled these weary pilgrims to renew their strength for the last leg of their journey before they ascended up into Jerusalem to the temple. Keep in mind why they were going to Jerusalem. Why were they going to Jerusalem? They were going up to the temple to worship God. So as they came to the end of their journey and they found themselves in the valley of Baca, they were reminded of the story found in Judges chapter 2. They knew that before they could worship a holy God, they had to deal with the sin in their lives. And so once again, this valley became a valley of tears. Their tears were tears of sorrow and tears of repentance.